Imagine this. You wake up feeling generous, the old habit of smiling before coffee already at work. You say yes because saying no feels like a breach of some invisible contract with goodness. You give time, lend trust, soften your voice to soothe. And then, quietly, the cracks begin not in your ideals, but in your life. Someone takes advantage. A friend fades when you need them. A partner leaves without explanation. Your kindness is not only unreciprocated, it becomes the very lever used to pry you open and push you aside. How can the one who mends be the one who is most easily broken? The paradox sits heavy like a stone in your chest. Decency should protect, yet it seems to expose. The world teaches us that being nice is a moral shield, a social currency that buys safety. But what if that shield is also a billboard saying, vulnerable here? What if the more you cultivate the persona of his self who is always kind, the mask you perform to keep peace, the more you invite unseen forces to test where your lines are drawn? Carl Jung, who mapped the human soul with a cartographer's stubbornness, would call this tension an inevitable clash between the persona and the shadow. You live publicly as the generous one. Unconsciously, you relegate anger, self-interest, and the capacity for boundary setting to the basement of your psyche. And the problem isn't that those darker parts exist, but that you've handed the world the key. Ask yourself, who benefits from your endless availability? Whose needs are being served when you silence a protest so the conversation won't rock the boat? Kindness becomes a currency. Yes, but whose ledger is it balancing? Is your niceness an honest gift or a carefully calibrated habit born of fear? You tell yourself you're being altruistic, but what if the deeper motive is avoidance, of conflict, of abandonment, of the risk that someone might see you as imperfect? Jung taught that what we deny in ourselves does not disappear. It reappears in the other as projection. When you refuse to acknowledge your own neediness or capacity for selfishness, you paint those traits onto others and then judge them harshly. If kindness becomes moral armor against inner complexity, it will also distort how you read the world and whom you allow close enough to wound you. Feel the existential tension. You are torn between the ideal of benevolence and the accumulating evidence of harm. Your identity soft, obliging, good feels both precious and perilous. The question is not merely ethical, but ontological. What does it mean to be a nice person who keeps getting hurt? Is niceness a virtue or a symptom? Is your goodness an authentic expression of character, or is it a ritual enacted to keep your deeper self out of sight? Jung would insist this is not a moral failing, but a psychic imbalance, a compensatory choreography, where the ego sacrifices its full dimension to maintain a flattering social self. Consider the role of boundaries. Nice people often believe boundaries are unkind. They confuse harshness with honesty. But when you equate firmness with cruelty, you abdicate the very role that preserves selfhood. You think you protect relationships by accommodating, but in truth, you thin the membrane that separates you from exploitation. Every unvoiced yes is a tiny fracture. Over time, these fractures map into an architecture of hurt. And then there is the subtle dance of attachment and expectation. You give expecting nothing, and then are astonished when someone takes everything. Why the astonishment if part of you already traded in a claim to reciprocity? When your kindness is unconditional in the way of a martyr, you are not merely kind. You are, in Jungian terms, compensating for an inner deficit. A need to be needed, a fear of abandonment, a hunger for worth tethered to usefulness. What seems like generosity externally often conceals a private ledger of self-worth that demands repayment in gratitude, loyalty, or validation. When the world fails to settle that debt, hurt follows. These are hard questions that don't yield to simple answers. They force you to look at the architecture of your soul, the persona that pleases, the shadow that frightens, the projections that bind you to repeat patterns. They raise the piercingly quiet possibility that being nice is not just about kindness, but about a defensive economy you inherited and sustained. So what does Jung say is at the root of this? How do the mechanisms of projection, persona, and shadow conspire to make the decent suffer most? And if this is true, what shifts in consciousness could change the pattern? Ahead lies the work and excavation of your inner landscape where light and dark intersect, and where the very things you call virtues may hide the reasons you bleed. Imagine that the softness you cultivate is not merely a habit, but a signal flaring in the dusk, visible, legible, and irresistible to those who would harvest it. There is a hidden architecture undergirding why niceness becomes vulnerability, and it is built from three interlocking forces: psychic economy, philosophical legacies, and social incentives. Each one nudges you toward a performance of goodness that conceals a deficit, and together they form a pressure so ordinary you scarcely notice it until the seams burst. Psychologically, Jung gives the clearest map. Your persona is the face you show the world, a carefully chosen costume optimized for acceptance. It is practical and necessary, but when it monopolizes identity, it amputates parts of your soul. The shadow those traits you deny, disown, or deem unacceptable does not vanish. Jung would say it waits, hungry and active, and when you keep it locked away, you begin to project. Projection is the psychic sleight of hand that makes others the container for what you refuse to own. Your anger becomes their cruelty. Your self-interest appears as their selfishness. Your capacity for boundary setting looks like coldness when exercised by someone else. If you never admit you are flawed, you will interpret the world as inexcusably flawed. The consequence? A moral blind spot that misreads predatory behavior as a personal betrayal rather than a predictable interaction. Philosophy amplifies the danger. Nietzsche, with his scalpel wit, described how simmering resentment built on impotence produces moralities that praise weakness as virtue. When society elevates meekness and condemns assertion, you inhabit a moral narrative that rewards your sacrifice and sanctions your strength. You are praised for your renunciation, even as you are diminished by it. Schopenhauer would point out the metaphysical backdrop: a world driven by will and suffering, where altruism can be a disguise for unacknowledged desires. Huxley would warn about a culture that pacifies dissent with feel-good platitudes and consumer comforts, turning your agreeable nature into a tranquilizer that keeps the system humming. Socially, niceness is a currency with built-in asymmetry. Systems, families, workplaces, networks learn to economize. They notice margins and exploit them. When you habitually give without ledgering, you become the system's buffer. Your generosity absorbs friction. Your avoidance of conflict lubricates processes. That makes you efficient to others and dispensable to yourself. Add the accelerant of social media and therapeutic vocabulary, where virtue signaling and self-care, hashtags mask avoidance, and you have a cultural climate that rewards surface kindness while tolerating exploitation. Are you surprised that people learn to take what is freely offered? But this is not merely external. Your internal narrative participates. Sartre's idea of bad faith is instructive. You can lie to yourself about why you act kindly, claiming ethical purity while secretly fleeing responsibility for your rage, your needs, your freedom. Acting from a self that is half-mask is easier than facing the vertigo of authentic choice. Frankl, who insisted that meaning arises from responsibility and suffering borne intentionally, would argue that giving that undermines your capacity to choose is not meaningful generosity. It is abdication. When you give because you must remain lovable, not because you freely choose it, you trade existential agency for social currency, and that trade has a cost measured in recurring hurt. The hidden force, then, is an interplay of concealment and reward. The ego hides its edges, the culture rewards the mask, and others adapt to those seams. You become a mirror that reflects back an ideal, and humanity, capricious and often pragmatic, treats mirrors as tools. This produces behavioral patterns that feel almost surgical. You learn to speak softly, to soften boundaries, to smooth conflict. Your emotions are patterned to avoid escalation, suppressed anger, practiced guilt when asserting yourself, a deepening hunger for approval. Identity calcifies into a single role nice, so any deviation feels like falling off a cliff. The result is an emotional economy of erosion, small daily compromises that accumulate into chronic depletion. Notice the paradox. What you cultivate to be safe becomes a magnet for harm. Why? Because vulnerability is not neutral. It is information. In a world of limited empathy and abundant needs, signals of low self-protection invite testing. Predators, literal or just people with low conscientiousness, read soft boundaries and press. Friends and acquaintances, too, will learn your threshold and often push until it becomes yours. The deeper consequence is not only episodic betrayal, but structural identity thinning. You stop learning to refuse. You lose practice in holding ground. The muscle of self-possession atrophies, and with it the capacity to form relationships that are reciprocal rather than parasitic. This dynamic also reshapes moral assessment. When kindness is decoupled from self-respect, it becomes performative virtue that expects reward, or paradoxically, punishment when not acknowledged. Nietzsche's insight reappears. You can sanctify suffering to maintain moral superiority, a subtle narcissism wrapped in humility. Huxley's nightmare of a society pacified by pseudo-virtue becomes intimate. You become complicit in your own sedation, trading passionate life for social approbation. Frankl's antidote, finding meaning through responsible suffering, grows harder as you are trained to suffer in silence rather than choose suffering for a cause. And still, people will tell you the answer is simply to be less nice, harder, firmer, colder. But that's a brittle remedy. The issue is not blunt polarity, it is integration. Jung's call is not to reject the persona, but to reintegrate the shadow, to own anger, need, desire, and the capacity to say no without shame. The philosophical lesson is not to valorize cruelty, but to reclaim strength as a precondition for genuine generosity. The social challenge is to cultivate systems that value reciprocity and teach boundary respect as a communal norm. None of this is quick. You are being asked to excavate yourself, to feel the ancient shame, to meet your anger without becoming it, to reframe kindness as practice that requires limits. What you are feeling now, unease, recognition, maybe defiance, is the first small quarry blown open. Deeper consequences ripple outward. Relationships that seem to hold may not outlast the moment you stop performing. Institutions that relied on your soft labor will recalibrate and maybe collapse. And your own soul may court a colder nihilism if never taught a different grammar of giving. The excavation begins here, but the deeper sights how to reintegrate, rebuild boundaries, and transform niceness into a strength that doesn't bleed are still ahead. You begin to sense the cost not as a dramatic catastrophe, but as a slow corrosion, an erosion that happens in the weather of daily life. Think of it as invisible tectonics. Habits shift minutely, neural pathways reroute, social expectations harden. And by the time you notice, the landscape has changed, the valleys have deepened, and the bridges you once crossed are gone. Why does this happen so quietly? Because the mechanisms that make you easy to use are also the ones that keep you from seeing yourself clearly. Cognitive biases and neural wiring conspire with cultural stories to turn a moral posture into a trap. Start with bias. Your brain is an efficiency engine. Confirmation bias will gather every instance where your niceness was rewarded and tuck it into a mental ledger, while politely misfiling the catastrophes as exceptions or your own failures. The fundamental attribution error will let you explain away another person's exploitation as their momentary lapse, while turning your own similar acts into evidence of a flawed world. Negativity bias, paradoxically, will make the betrayals feel larger than the kindnesses that preceded them, not because they are objectively larger, but because your brain gives more weight to damage than to maintenance. These distortions don't merely misrepresent events. They shape the story you tell yourself about who you are, and that story directs how you act next. Neuroscience supplies the muscle for these stories. Oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone, peaks when you are generous. It rewards pro-social behavior by lighting up the brain's reward centers. That feel-good surge becomes a biochemical reinforcement loop. Give, feel rewarded, give again. Mirror neurons attune you to others' emotions, making you exquisitely sensitive to needs and cues, an advantage in caregiving, a vulnerability in negotiation. Meanwhile, the amygdala, primed by early attachment wounds or repeated anxiety, will hijack your prefrontal cortex whenever conflict looms. In that moment, your capacity for strategic, self-protective thought shrinks. You default to the pattern that historically kept rejection at bay. Appease, soften, yield. Neuroplasticity then cements these responses into habit. The net effect is physiological. Your body learns to prefer being pliant because it has been biologically rewarded for it. There are paradoxes in these processes. You crave authenticity, yet your brain as reward circuitry pushes you toward strategies that preserve social belonging at the expense of truth. You want respect, but the hormonal payoff of being needed leaves you asleep at the wheel of your own boundaries. Each neurological advantage that made you socially adept becomes a doorway through which exploitation slips. Cultural conditioning fans the flames. Gender scripts teach girls to be small and accommodating. Religious moralities prize meekness as holiness. Workplace norms reward the person who takes on extra tasks with a smile. Social media broadcasts curated images of virtue kindness framed as moral, Instagrammable actions, while obscuring the fatigue behind them. Collectivist cultures valorize harmony and subtly shame dissent. All of these structures create a social economy where your agreeableness is prized as public good while your private depletion is invisible. You are applauded for being the soft landing pad, and yet no one pays the bill for the wear incurred. The urgency comes from how quickly systems adapt. Once you are known as the nice one, people do not need to plan. They simply expect. That expectation becomes a social algorithm that updates with remarkable speed. The neighbor who once asked for a favor now asks more often because your pattern signals availability. A colleague recalibrates their workload expectations because you've demonstrated capacity for extra labor. Relationships, organizations, and even entire cultures become optimized to harvest your pliancy. You are effective, useful, but your usefulness is the axis upon which others pivot, not a shared structure of mutual care. Projection complicates the picture in a uniquely Jungian way. When you refuse to recognize your own shadow, your selfishness, your anger, your need, you unconsciously project it onto others. You then judge them for faults that are mirror images of your denied parts. This psychic sleight of hand distorts moral perception. You interpret someone else's self-interest as betrayal because you have no language for your own. Projection breeds an endless cycle of misinterpretation, grievance, and the very hurt you fear. It is a closed system. The persona performs kindness to hide vulnerability. The shadow is denied and projected. Others respond predictably, and your persona is reinforced. The pattern loops until something interrupts it. What is striking and alarming is how obedient you become to the pattern. The more you practice deference, the less you remember how to refuse. The less you practice asserting needs, the stranger it feels should you ever attempt it. This is not moral cowardice. It is a kind of learned helplessness, sculpted by social reinforcement and neural habit. Your autonomy atrophies as surely as a muscle unused. And because autonomy is the psychic soil in which dignity grows, its loss is not a minor inconvenience. It is a decline that reshapes the arc of your life. Think of the moral economy that forms around this decline. Niceness without limits becomes a currency that others spend and drain. Reciprocity decays. Entitlement seeds itself. Gratitude becomes performative. In that economy, resentment is the hidden tax, accumulating quietly until you either explode or withdraw. Both outcomes are painful, and both were foretold the moment you chose habit over integration. Yet none of this is fate. The danger is not that you are broken, but that you are misled by hormones, by habits, by culture into equating being kind with being undemanding. The urgency is existential. Continue in this way, and you will watch opportunities for authentic reciprocity pass you by. Relationships ossify into roles, and your sense of self hollow out like a letter carved from a tree. Each day you endure small indignities. Your options narrow. The architecture of your life rearranges to make exploitation more efficient, not less. So you stand at a threshold of consequence and possibility, feeling both the chill of what has been lost and the heat of what might be reclaimed. The pattern that has allowed you to be useful to the world at the cost of yourself is visible now, if you will look. The breakthrough you are approaching is not a simple trick of behavior, but a tectonic reorientation of psyche and culture, the sort of shift Jung called individuation, to integrate shadow and persona, to reclaim agency without losing generosity. But that terrain is not yet mapped here. For now, the urgency is clear. The unseen consequences are real, aggregating into a life that rewards others more than it rewards you. And the longer you ignore them, the harder the excavation will be. Imagine the moment you decide that being kind will no longer mean being diminished. It is not a polite resolution. It is a small insurgency, a living reorientation that changes how your days stack into years. What if rebellion is not about rage or cruelty, but about learning to be generous from a position of strength? What if the revolutionary act is to refuse to be the easy option? Jung called individuation a lifelong insurrection against the parts of the self that would remain childlike forever. This is that insurrection rendered practical. First, you must accept a paradox. To be genuinely kind, you must learn to be uncompromising. That sounds like a contradiction, because the culture has taught you kindness equals softness. But imagine kindness with muscle firmness that contains empathy, refusal that preserves future giving. This shift is counterintuitive because it asks you to value your integrity more than your temporary likability. It asks you to feel the discomfort of saying no and to see that discomfort as training, not failure. Start with micro-rebellions. Refuse one request this week that you would previously have accepted out of anxiety. Say the word no without apology and watch how the body tightens, then releases. The first no will feel like blasphemy. The 50th will feel like reclamation. These are not theatrical gestures. They are neural retraining. You are teaching your amygdala that refusal need not mean annihilation. You are training others that your time and attention are not free commodities. Gandhi refused compliant niceness by aligning humility with iron discipline. His gentleness was a strategy because he protected the core of himself with ritual and limits. Rosa Parks refused a bus seat, not from incivility, but from a refusal to be continually diminished. Her quiet firmness was moral force, not cruelty. Reframe anger and need as useful signals rather than moral stains. Jung insisted that the shadow contains vitality energy denied becomes poison. Learn to translate those flashes of irritation into boundary language. I feel resentful when ... double quotes becomes a map for action. When you name need without drama, you stop feeding the projection engine that attributes your unadmitted desires to everyone else. Need expressed becomes an invitation for reciprocity. Need denied becomes a magnet for exploitation. Adopt contracts as spiritual technology. Many of the kind are verbally generous, but legally vague. Declare agreements, timelines, expectations, compensation. In relationships and at work, make reciprocity explicit. This is not finality, it is clarity. You are trading chaos for predictability. You are not asking to be loved less. You are asking for exchanges that honor both parties. Historically, Women like Eleanor Roosevelt redefined care by coupling empathy with clear standards. She did not confuse helpfulness with erasure. She staged her gentleness with policy, ritual, and public discipline. Practice the counterintuitive art of boringness. Predators are drawn to drama and pliability. Being steady, predictable, and unobjectionable often makes you less attractive as a target. When you stop performing frantic generosity for attention, you disrupt the market that monetizes your pliancy. Being reliably self-possessed sends a signal as loud as any argument. You are not a free bank. Learn to ritualize inner confrontation. Jungian work is not navel-gazing for its own sake. It is ethical labor. Set aside time each week to imagine the person you fear becoming the bitter, hungering version of yourself and speak to that figure. Write letters from your shadow and answer them. This paradoxical intimacy diffuses projection. You reclaim content that otherwise will be cast onto others. When your rage is owned and integrated, it stops being an accusation hurled at the world and becomes a calibrating tool. Rebuild your moral vocabulary. Replace kind as an identity marker with generous, sovereign, and discerning. Teach yourself to ask, before each impulse to give, am I offering this from surplus or from deficit? Surplus giving expands you. Deficit giving erodes you. The test is simple and brutal. If you give and feel exhausted, you are not practicing generosity. You are practicing avoidance. Shift the metric of moral worth from quantity of giving to sustainability of self. Create social experiments that reveal truth quickly. If you suspect a friend takes too much, propose a small, formalized exchange, a trade, a deadline, a restitution plan. Watch what happens. Those who value you will adapt. Those who exploit you will reveal their pattern. Historical rebels used tests. Rosa Parks' refusal was both an ethical stand and a social experiment that exposed systemic cruelty. You do not need to remake the world in a single day, but you can construct moments that tell you whether your labor is reciprocated. Cultivate allies who mirror your boundaries. The lonely rebel is vulnerable. Rebellion is easier within a network that rewards reciprocity. Find people who practice their own integrous generosity, those who refuse when needed, who repair when called, who do not weaponize guilt. Communities like this function as mirrors and scaffolds. They reflect back your progress and hold you when you falter. Embody small theatrics of refusal. When a colleague dumps more work on you, respond with a calm pitch. I can do X by Friday, or I can prioritize Y now. If we shift Z, which do you prefer? This is not passive aggression. It is an operationalized boundary. When you stop apologizing for limits and start offering alternatives, you convert conflict into negotiation. You reclaim agency. You teach others that you are a partner, not a perpetual servant. Finally, remember that revolution is an inner ecology. Integrating shadow will not make you invulnerable to pain. It will make your pain intelligible and useful. Jung did not promise comfort, he promised wholeness. You will lose some relationships that depended on your softness. That loss is not evidence of failure, but of new calibration. What stayed because you served, it survives. What bled you dry does not deserve the sanctuary of a renewed self. Stand in that refusal and feel the electricity. This is not a retreat from compassion. It is a radical redescription of it. You are learning to give from the center that will not be consumed. The rebellion is quiet, rigorous, and relentless. A daily practice of saying yes when it aligns with your soul and no when it preserves it. You are discovering that power need not crush kindness. Properly ordered, it protects it. That realization feels like treason against everything you were taught and like liberation. You reach the place where theory thins and something else begins. Not a trick, not a technique, but a truth that rearranges the furniture of your soul. What if the deepest reason nice people get hurt the most is not that the world is cruel, nor that you are weak, but that you have been living divided, giving from one hand while an invisible hand in your chest continually takes? Jung called this split a failure of integration. The persona presents a glossy kindness, while the shadow gathers power in the dark, unseen and resentful. Integration does not sweeten the shadow into niceness. It teaches you how to sit at table with all parts of yourself, so you are not surprised when the world reflects them back. Imagine a cathedral where one wing is open and ornately lit, and the other wing is bricked up and rotting. You worship in the light and send servants into the darkness, because you do not want to soil your robes. Those servants, your buried anger, your need, your desire for fairness, grow wild and resentful. They do not vanish, they infest the corridors. They emerge in others as accusations and betrayals because you have trained your psyche to outsource its hardness. This is Jung's final indictment. The soul cannot be halved without cost. Projection will bring your unowned parts back to you in the currency of hurt. So what is the ultimate realization you must hold like a lantern? It is this: your kindness will never be wise until it is armored by knowledge of your own shadow. Generosity without integration is a kind of sacrificial economics. It is giving from a deficit and attempt to purchase worth at the cost of your autonomy. True generosity arises when giving is surplus, when it comes from a replete center that has learned its own limits. That repletion is not a stoic hardening. It is a cultivated sufficiency, an inner treasury of self-possession that allows you to give boldly and withdraw without shame. Ask yourself, would the generous person you admire be more generous if they were hollow or if they were whole? The answer reverberates. Generosity and sovereignty are not enemies. They are a pair. Jung's individuation teaches you to bring the shadow to dinner, to accept the parts that frighten you, and to retrain your nervous system until refusal does not feel like sin. This is not pithy advice. It is a rigorous moral and psychic curriculum. It requires rituals, honest conversations, and the courage to be boring sometimes, because boring steadiness is the opposite of pliable spectacle. There is a second, sharper truth beneath this. Pain is not merely a consequence of external exploitation. It is often the soul's punctuation mark saying enough. Hurt is information. It is the ache that signals misalignment between who you appear to be and who you psychologically are. When you lock away hunger and resentment, those energies will push back in the form of betrayal, irritation, or collapse. Jung would nod. The psyche speaks in symptoms. Wounds are sentences the soul writes to itself until you read them. Now, imagine you read those sentences differently. Instead of recoiling, you translate them. Each sting becomes a teacher, revealing where you lack limits, where your words have become rituals, where your generosity has been a demand for validation. The work is to turn the intelligence of hurt into a curriculum for change slow, stubborn, and elegant. You practice smaller refusals until the muscle grows. You ritualize confession to your shadow until projection loses its foothold. You make reciprocity explicit, so kindness does not become a free-for-all. And there is a paradox that will become a lit lantern on the path. The less you perform niceness for approval, the more people who truly love you will remain. Those who depart were aligned with your old role, not your person. Their exit is not a defeat. It is a recalibration. You will be lonely at first, as if a crowd in a theater has emptied while the lights hum. But the emptiness is a prelude to shape. In that new space, you will learn to practice generosity that keeps itself healthy. You will learn to trust your refusal as much as your yes. Let the cinematic image settle. You stand at a shoreline at dusk. Behind you, the village taught you to hand out fruit until your basket was empty, smiling through the emptiness because the smile kept storms away. Before you, the ocean is vast and indifferent and truthful. The shadow walks beside you, no longer hidden, but acknowledged, an awkward human companion. You are not perfect. Perfection is not the point. The point is that you walk forward with two hands finally visible to yourself. One that gives, one that preserves. What action does this demand? Not a manifesto, but small insurgencies. One honest no each week. One contract signed where previously promises were whispered. One moment of solitude where you listened to the voice that was always placated. These are the rituals of reorientation. They are mundane and seismic at once, because habit is a landscape shaped by small repetitions. Jung's individuation does not end in solitude. It ends in a reattended relation to the world, one where your generosity is sustainable, fierce, and dignified. This is the consequence and the promise. Refuse to be merely usable. Make your life a place where kindness is not a signal that announces weak defenses, but a choice that flows from integrated plenitude. When you do this, the pattern that once made you the easiest harvest will crack like frost on a river. People will press, and some will leave. Others will come who are willing to give back. The world will not suddenly turn gentle, but your negotiations with it will be different, clearer, truer, less predicated on performance. Listen to that final, shocking invitation to stop being a role and become a real person. That task is dangerous because it strips you of coldly acquired applause. It is also liberating because it returns you to a life where pain has meaning and generosity has integrity. Walk toward it like a thief, reclaiming what was stolen from you, your right to be whole. Walk toward it like an artist, stubbornly making a life that will hold both tenderness and boundary, laughter and refusal. You will fail sometimes. You will give from lack and pay tuition in sorrow. Let the sorrow teach you. Let Jung's map guide you back and forth across your inner terrain until your persona and shadow speak to one another in a language you can live by. There is no final perfection, only a pilgrimage. Each no that preserves you, each yes that nourishes you, becomes a stanza in a new poem about who you were always meant to be. As dusk deepens into night, imagine lighting a single lamp in the cathedral's formerly bricked wing. The light reveals dust, old markings, and a small door. You kneel, open it, and step into a place that will ask everything of you and give nothing cheap in return. The world will still bruise you, but now you bring a body that knows itself. That is the revolution. Kinder, yes, because you are whole. Safer, yes, because you are sovereign. Truer, always because you finally see who you are and will not be used as proof of someone else as goodness.